यथा वायुं समश्रित्य वर्तन्ते सर्वजन्तवः तथा गृहस्थमाश्रित्य वर्तन्ते सर्व आश्रमः. Just as every living being depends on air to live, every life stage depends on the family householder, the Grihastha's life stage, to exist. Celebrity weddings easily become objects of adulation, envy, and of course, sociological commentary. When I started writing this essay, I was, of course, thinking about the wedding of Anant Ambani and Radhika Merchant. But now some time has passed, and more recently, I was thinking about another celebrity wedding which has a more direct existential bearing on me, and that is the wedding of my mother, Srimati Jamuna, and my father, Professor J.V. Ramana Rao, in Tirupati in August 1965. So, although this essay is about the phenomenon of weddings and the changing attitudes to marriage and family among Indian youth based on some surveys, I want us to recognize that every one of us, in a way, has a debt to our parents' wedding. And we also have a duty, I think, to educate the next generation, our children, on what exactly we expect from them, how much we can impose on them, how much freedom we should give them. And one way we can do this is by talking about the spiritual and cultural importance of weddings. Another way we can also do it is by talking about the sociological picture. What is changing in society, and is it a good thing or a bad thing, and what are the consequences? So that is what I would like to try and explore as a social scientist in this little essay. So back to my commentary on the Ambani wedding. So of course, the wedding of Anant Ambani and Radhika Merchant has inspired much praise and criticism over the last few months. While nationalists and traditionalists were cheering, critics were complaining, of course, that such a display of wealth in a society where many still live in poverty is in bad taste. These are both predictable responses. But if there's one theme that I thought was important to the family at the center of it all, it is the idea of marriage as an important part of the Hindu understanding of life, nature, the cosmos, and of course, most importantly, the bond between the gods and the humans. Apart from the heartfelt expressions of Krishna Bhakti during this wedding in the form of art and songs, and also the emphasis on traditional rituals, there was a viral video of Nita Ambani speaking about the idea of Kanyadan, which underscored how elders and youngsters still seem to value such an understanding of marriage, not simply as a social or recreational indulgence, but as a sacred, existentially significant practice, even after so many generations. After all, in every Hindu wedding, we still remember the wedding of Sita and Rama, as described by the poets and artists, and of course, by legendary filmmakers like Bapu Ramana Garu. So, what I want to emphasize is that culture is not a static phenomenon. It's a work that endures in time. The traditions, the gods we invoke through them, are all anchors of societal reproduction, intergenerational continuity, and of course, just the continuity of life itself. It is in this context that I would like to turn to some more sobering considerations about where India and the world are heading on the question of marriage. In the last few hours of the Ambani wedding media sensation, somebody I follow on social media left a piercing comment on the state of youngsters in marriage today. He wrote that half the young people he knew were in the process of getting divorced, and the other half, they were avoiding marriage altogether because they were scared. This trend is already quite widespread in Western societies. As Professor Jean Twenge notes in her studies of generational change, it seems that Gen Z, that is today's youth cohort born between 1995 to 2010, might, quote, not just postpone marriage and relationships, but not enter them at all. The percentage of American youth between 20 to 24 who are married used to be as high as 70% in 1960. This has dropped to about 10% in 2020. Attitudes to relationships have changed, with the percentage of 12th graders saying, quote, marriage and family are extremely important, having dropped from about 75% in the 1970s to about 65% now. Birth rates too have declined, as we all know. But the issue here is not any normative concern about demography or tradition. The real issue is the catastrophic change in attitudes to not only marriage but even relationships among the young. So it's not about insisting that everybody has to get married or everyone has to get married in a certain way or to a certain person. It is a broader question of human beings' ability to have responsible and happy relationships with other human beings in the modern world. That itself is under strain. So here is an example. Twench talks about the pervasive fear of relationships that seems to exist among the young in her book iGen. And she says that there is now a greater taboo among the youth today about, quote unquote, catching feelings than being called a slut. Insult, like the word slut, which normally people would be insulted about, is not seen as hurtful as bad, apparently, among the young today as this phrase catching feelings, which just means getting emotionally attached to a person. So that is a picture in America. What about the picture in India? The CSDS KAS Youth Survey, a survey of youth done by the Center for Study of Developing Societies, a very extensive survey. It was done first in 2007 and again in 2016. This tells us that the proportion of married youth in India, and here youth is defined as age 15 to 34, has declined from 54% in 2007 to 46% in 2016. Just like in America, okay, so in a young, maybe a slightly smaller number of people are getting married, especially at a younger age, and one might think that's all fine. But here is the interesting discovery of this survey. The share of youth who agree that, quote, in life it is important to get married, this has declined by half. In 2007, 80% of youth surveyed said it is important to get married in life. In 2016, only 40% were saying that. So that's a pretty sharp change in terms of attitudes. Now, while a small section of elite social thinkers and policymakers might view the eradication of marriage and family itself as progressive ideals, the truth is that most people today, regardless of class, caste, religion, or gender, would prefer to see the problems faced by young people in settling down intelligently solved rather than having the institution of marriage thrown out altogether or turned into just a lifestyle statement. So we need to find a way to respect the desire of elders to see grown-up children build loving families of their own as they themselves ease into old age and mortality, and the desire of youngsters to find a balance between tradition and modernity and freedom and responsibility. Until a few decades or a couple of generations ago, such a process happened organically. However, as the trends among millennials and Gen Z indicate, perhaps Indian youth too will need more informed engagement and guidance on questions they may be too young, busy, or distracted to really pay attention to. This kind of guidance, unfortunately, is not available anymore given the fragmentation of families, the loss of contact and authority with elders. Such guidance is unfortunately not easily available anymore given the fragmentation of families, loss of contact and authority with elders, and the overemphasis placed by parents on children's economic advancement, often reducing marriage decisions to the same calculus rather than on a cultural and spiritual education in marriage as a daunting but ultimately noble and rewarding social and biocosmological duty. A child today grows up absorbing impractical and destructive messages about what human beings, love, or even traditions mean. This is happening through the social media culture, celebrity culture, and also, of course, through the school curriculum. The modern school system, after all, is designed to groom students into becoming citizens, workers, or activists, but not future mothers and fathers, even though the latter is a role that many adults will have to play in real life. And of course, in more modern countries, the signs of change are evident. In China, for example, there is talk of a last generation, a cohort of youngsters who have lost hope for their economic future and prefer not to have children at all. In America, as Twench writes, 36% of Gen Z children have been born to unmarried mothers, and they are quite likely growing up without the presence of fathers. It is easy to attribute such trends to individual freedom of choice, But then we can't avoid naming the elephant in the room either. There are consequences to people's lives and to society as a whole when families are allowed to collapse. There is an urgent need for cultural leadership to arrest this tide. The growing global ideological trends discouraging youth from marriage and even having stable relationships should be studied and neutralized. With this objective in mind, I had a far-fetched idea, but I think if it happened, it would be beneficial to society. I wanted to suggest to Mrs. Neeta Ambani that she should establish a cultural education institution for the purpose of preparing youth while still in school or college for a responsible and happy married life ahead. So, this institution should involve the work of social scientists, family counselors, traditional scholars who know the Vedas and Dharma Shastras, as well as New Age gurus who can talk about meditation and happiness and health and all these things. It could also involve anthropologists and ethnographers who do research and can express the wonderful and diverse cultural customs around weddings in our country and around the world. And of course, there could be musicians, stand-up comedians, poets, cartoonists, bring together all kinds of different people to produce very engaging and intelligent content on marriage and family. In the same way that in earlier times, civics textbooks used to educate children about, the government or civic and social duties, or in the past few years, about activism and protests. Very simply, any child in India who has gone to school in the last 15, 20 years or will go to school in the next 10, 20 years is going to get a very good education on their responsibilities to society in a very general way, like voting and taking part in protests and changing society, fighting inequality. All of this is happening through the schools. But who is teaching them that social change also begins at home? That social change is not just about destroying all traditions, destroying families, destroying responsible relationships with each other, but it is also about making sure that human beings honor their duties to each other. Human beings can trust each other and depend on each other in life. And for that, we need to put in a lot of investment into education about what marriage and relationships really mean. This doesn't have to impose any one definition or one way of looking at the institution of marriage. There could be a diversity of voices and traditions. But the important thing is to just let children accept the idea, even when they're young, that when they grow up, one of their duties in life or one of the things they may have to do is to get married and have a family. Without that kind of education, I think most children today are growing up with a very abnormal and exploitable idea of what it means to be a human being. And as a result of that, by the time they're in their 20s and 30s, many of them remain lonely and single and unhappy, or jump into relationships without thinking things through and end up with a lot of conflict and divorce. So to sum up, here is the big picture. Now, for a long time, we took it for granted that intergenerational continuity was fine in India. It was not changing, whereas in the West, it is collapsing. But then, as the surveys tell us, even in India, the figures from 2007 to 2016 suggest that things are changing very quickly. So I think it's important that all of us who are parents, teachers, or leaders, and just respected figures in society today, should take responsibility for the next generation's happiness. We have to help them imagine how difficult it will be for them to be happy if they remain lonely and isolated when they grow up. Companionship, trust, and family are a part of life. They're as important as having a nice home or car, and we need to make sure they know how to get that. So we basically have to be the generation of adults that saves the institution of family from collapsing into meaningless individualism, anomie, and angst. So I'm thinking now of a movie that came 30 years ago, which I did my first research project on. It was called Hum Aapke Hai Kaun. Now, Hum Aapke Hai Kaun was a super hit, and it revived interest in traditional wedding ceremonies. And that movie ended with a declaration, if you remember, saying Hum Aapke Hai. Okay, so just saying that we are yours. So it concluded that the ideal of family life is to live in a spirit of dedication to each other. But then we also have to realize that Hum Aapke Hai also applies to not just the people we are living with today, but also our descendants who are going to come in the future. We also have to say hum aapke hai to people who might come in the future. And we have to ensure that they have a good life, they have a good set of memories and values and traditions inherited from us. So teaching our children the truth about ideal relationships, family, marriage and parenting right now will ensure that their happiness and ours and our ancestors will all be taken care of. Santushto bharyaya bhatta, bharta bharya tataivacha, yasmin neva kulai nityam, kalyanam tatravai dhruvam. The family in which the husband and wife are happy is a family that will have peace, prosperity, and security. Shubham.